Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and as promised in last week's video, this week we're going to be taking a look at one of my absolute favorite Spawn miniseries with Medieval Spawn Witchblade #1. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in May of 1996, we start off with a terrific cover by Brandon Peterson. Seriously, I think that this looks amazing. And I'd also like to point out that this is, in my opinion, the perfect example of an illustration that doesn't necessarily need a background. Those of you who have watched my channel for any length of time know that I'm quite the stickler for images having backgrounds behind them, be they panels or covers. However, it's not always needed, and this is one of those instances where it isn't. And that's because, one, you have the characters of Medieval Spawn and Witchblade taking up over 2/3 of the entire cover, and the logo to the book taking up most of the last third. So whatever background could have been drawn here would have been really kind of pointless and added nothing to this image as a whole. So again, as much as I rag on people for not putting them into panels and covers, it's not always needed, and this is one of those instances where you can get a really fantastic dynamic cover without having to put a really detailed background behind it. Written by Garth Ennis, penciled by Brandon Peterson, inked by Bat, and also Joe Weems V on specifically page number 20. Colored by Ashby Manson. Computer colored by Richard Eisenoff, Jonathan D. Smith, Steve Furchow, I believe is how you're supposed to say that, Tyson Wengler. Dennis Heisler, letters. David Wohl, editor. Michael Urton, associate editor. Victor Lamas, ink assists. Peter Steigerwald, graphic design. Paul Arroyo, I believe, and Mary Buxton, production. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about over here in the names. Number one, I totally forgot that Garth Ennis was the one who wrote this book. Or, well, not just this book, but the entire miniseries. Shocking. I don't know how I completely forgot that was the case, but it is absolutely the case that Garth Ennis is responsible for writing this entire story. And also, if you're someone who has been watching my channel for any length of time and been keeping up with most of the videos, you may recognize the name Peter Steigerwald. This is because Peter was incredibly instrumental in the coloring of the original Lady Mechanica miniseries. And if you'd like to know more about that miniseries and check out more of Peter's work, you can find it in my Lady Mechanica playlist. Getting into the story, it begins in New York City on a lovely sunny day, where we see a man sitting on the bank of what I believe is the Delaware River, as I'm almost 100% certain that this is supposed to be the George Washington Bridge, and he's by himself with only a plain brown package sitting next to him, as he looks out over the city and thinks to himself, I really wonder what it's going to look like here in 6 months. Suddenly, the man is interrupted in his thoughts as a voice coming from within the box sitting next to him begins to taunt him and insult his mother. However, this doesn't really affect the man, as he simply playfully responds to the voice coming from within the box, which only makes the voice within this box even more angry, as the voice then states, well, I hope that this little apocalypse that you've been planning blows up in your face. However, the man on the bench is not exactly worried about any of the taunts coming from within the box, as he responds, well, at least I'm not a severed head in a box. The box then goes silent, and the severed head from within then responds by simply calling him a bastard. The man on the bench then states, I've been waiting for this for over 800 years, and finally my plan is about to come to fruition, and he is very happy to see this plan finally play out. We are then teleported into the past, specifically to the year 1175 AD, where we see a castle sitting on top of a mountain on a dark night. Inside of the castle, a man by the name of Lord Cardinale has granted an audience to the man that we saw on the bench, whose name is Matthew Royale. Lord Cardinale is actually kind of confused here, as he doesn't exactly know what Matthew Royale wants from him. However, Matthew tells him that he has a proposition for Lord Cardinale, and that his proposition is to make him truly powerful. However, you may notice something very unique about Lord Cardinale, and that is the armor that he's wearing. Any of you watching may happen to notice that this armor is very familiar looking, and that is because Lord Cardinale possesses the powers of the darkness. The same darkness who is from the Witchblade universe. However, Lord Cardinale is not Jackie Estacado, as is the darkness in the 90s. He is a completely different and unique character. They just both have the same powers. However, Lord Cardinale tells Matthew that he is too late because he has already conquered all of his enemies and has used his magical prowess to create everything that Matthew sees before him. His armies, the Citadel, even his queen, the Lady Eleanor, and that with the powers of the darkness he is already mighty. However, Matthew makes an interesting counter-argument when he tells him, yes, my lord, but your powers only work in the absence of sunlight or deep beneath the earth, and eventually your enemies will realize that your armies do not march during the day, and at that point your reign will be over. Realizing that Matthew is more knowledgeable than he originally thought, Lord Cardinale then asks what exactly Matthew suggests he should do. Matthew then tells him that the plan should be to basically lead an assault on the other world, as he puts it, which I can only assume he means as a different dimension of Faerie, as the land of Faerie has unimaginable magic and spells that exist there that were created by the people who live in that world, and that if Lord Cardinale were to get his hands on all that magic, he would become truly unstoppable. He then goes on to say that the light in the world of Faerie does not come from the same sun as it does on Earth, meaning that Lord Cardinale's powers will work during the day in that land. However, at this point, the Lady Eleanor seems to have a pretty decent head on her shoulders and asks Matthew, what exactly do you have to gain from all of this? Matthew responds by telling her that the world of Faerie also contains interesting magics that, while they don't provide any type of militaristic value, are of great interest to him on a purely academic level. However, Lady Eleanor doesn't really seem to buy this, as she states, do you really think that we're going to believe you when you say that? Unfortunately, she is immediately cut off when Lord Cardinale says, this is a perfect plan. We're going to do it with great haste. And Lady Eleanor is quite shocked that he's so quickly just going along with the plan of this total stranger. However, Matthew tells them that they won't regret this course of action. The next day, we are teleported to the land of Faerie as we see two elven folk strolling through the forest, surrounded by fairies and other magical creatures. One of these elven folk talks about how wonderful and beautiful the world is and how he so often forgets to just simply stroll around and appreciate the true beauty and magic of their world, when suddenly an arrow shoots directly through his forehead and kills him instantly, which I'd imagine is a terrible way to start your morning. As the elven man falls to his death, his associate cries out in terror. However, he is suddenly interrupted when a nearby voice tells him not to worry, as he'll be joining him shortly. We then see an army of orcs pouring through a portal in the sky, and the lead orc exclaims that we are the armies of the darkness, and we serve Lord Cardinale, and we are here to conquer this world. As the other elven man begs for his life, his cries go unanswered as he is suddenly beheaded by the lead orc. We then see from the castle of Lord Cardinale that he is watching all of this unfold through some sort of magical mirror, perhaps? And he seems to be quite excited, as it looks as though none of the elven folk have any answer for this assault and are being slaughtered. He cheers, screaming, I always hated the elves. However, Matthew then chimes in and offers a word of warning to Lord Cardinale, as though it may seem his victory is at hand, it doesn't mean that there won't be any problems involved in doing this. Matthew then goes on to explain to Lord Cardinale that the relationship between the world of Faerie and Earth is really quite complicated, and that there are multiple nexus points that connect the two worlds, and that the battle that he has started may cause a spillover into the world of Earth, which might end up getting any number of other people involved in it. This, of course, is coming as we also see the medieval Spawn riding through the forest on his steed, and would lead us to believe that he'll shortly be getting involved in this battle, given that he is one of the title characters. At this moment, we see a portal open up in front of him, and the Battle of Faerie pour out of the portal as we see multiple orcs slaughtering elven folk. This does not sit well with the medieval Spawn, as he immediately commands the orcs to cease this behavior. However, one of the orcs turns and tells him to get lost if he knows what's good for him. However, before he can finish his sentence, the medieval Spawn immediately beheads this orc, which leads to a battle between himself and the remaining orcs that poured out of the portal. The rest of the orcs then try to bum rush medieval Spawn. However, he responds by running one of them through with his sword while using his necro energy to then melt the face clean off of an orc that grabs his arm. However, at this point, he and all of the orcs are sucked back through the portal into the world of Faerie. Upon witnessing this, Lord Cardinale is rather confused as he asks who this bloody stranger even is. He is then informed by Matthew, who tells him that it is a spawn, and quite a young one, oddly enough. The Lady Eleanor asks if this spawn poses any threat to their plan, and Matthew turns to her and immediately dismisses her concerns, stating that he is, of course, no threat to them or what they're trying to accomplish. Which I do find kind of odd. If Matthew knows what a hellspawn is, it seems to me that he would be a little bit more wary of one becoming involved in what's going on with their plan, but he seems incredibly confident that this hellspawn being involved poses literally no threat to anything that they're doing. We then get an advertisement for Witchblade number 6. Now, I will admit, I don't know very much about Witchblade. I've never really read any of the Witchblade comics, and my knowledge of Witchblade is really limited to just the little bits about the character that I've read online and whatever, Witchblade lore we gained from this particular miniseries. Though I would point out that you might notice the name Michael Turner being involved and notice that this is very familiar artwork to some of you, and that's because this is indeed the same Michael Turner who founded Aspen Comics and created the comic book Fathom. We are then teleported to a random inn in merry old England, where a woman by the name of Katerina is quite angry about a bill that she has just received from said inn. She exclaims that it's highway robbery to charge her 90 bits for a week's stay and breakfast at this inn. However, the innkeeper responds by telling her that the bill is for a lot more than just her bed and breakfast. He goes on to list that it also includes the 47 tankards of ale she drank, all of the furniture that was destroyed during the fights that she started, the curtains which are covered in blood, also from said fights, and all of the money that he had to spend to bribe the local constable to keep her from being arrested. At this point, Katerina tries to argue, stating that she didn't start any fights, and Stalker reminds her that she walked right up to Volgnir the Viking, told him he had a face like a scabby dog's rectum, and then proceeded to start beating the living crap out of him. And if that's not a fight, what exactly is? Katerina tries to brush it off, stating that he made a pass at her, but Stalker tells her that this is irrelevant, that she could have just walked away, and that her being here is bad for business and he expects to be compensated. However, we then learn that Katerina is a bit short on funds, as she is basically flat broke. Although at this point, Stalker doesn't seem too angry because he tells her he has a plan in place for just such occasions. Stalker then leads Katerina out back, where he shows her a pile of manure the size of a house. He then tells her that if she's willing to use that cart to transport all the manure down the road to the local dung emporium, that should square up their bill. Katerina is not too keen on this idea, as she asks him if there's any other plans that he may have in place for dealing with her bill. He then gives her a sleazy glance. Knowing what he means by this, Katerina curses him and tells him to just give her the shovel already. We then see her standing atop the pile of manure, shoveling it into the cart, still cursing his name, as Stalker laughs and drinks, telling her to be joyful in her work. We are then granted to a lovely pinup by one Mark Silvestri on pencils, Joe Weems V on inks, and Tyson Wegner on colors. I am a big fan of this centerfold, as you'll see in just a moment. And here we go with Mark Silvestri doing exactly what Mark Silvestri does best, delivering top-notch, super detailed characters. And while I do think this is a terrific pinup, I really wish this one had a background. The background is really just kind of colors and nothingness, as the two characters are apparently perched on top of a mountain. We don't know for certain. And I honestly believe that had a background existed behind them, it would have taken what's already a phenomenal pinup and just pushed it up into the stratosphere of being absolutely exquisite. Again, I'm not complaining because this is still really, really good, but I do believe it would have been made better by having a nice background behind it. We then see an advertisement for the Cyberforce Summer Trading Card Set, which is advertised as containing the hottest getups and steamiest locations. And, I never cease to be amazed at how much the image creators, notably Jim Lee, but also Mark Silvestri, as we can see here, are just unabashedly going directly after the 13-year-old boy market with the way that they're advertising this stuff. I mean, I get it. I know why you're doing it, and to some extent, I'd have to believe that it was effective. But at the same time, it seems like maybe you would have a little bit more decorum and not be quite so front and center with what type of advertising you're doing and what type of consumer you're going for. But then again, that's just me. Getting back into the story, we see that Katarina continues to shovel and turn around and ask Stalker what exactly he's looking at. He then tells her he is just enjoying the view, making a not so thinly veiled comment about the level of attractiveness he considers her to have, which only enrages Katarina more. However, Stalker then tells her to settle down, as he knows for a fact that despite her putting on the front of being this amazingly tough sellsword from some exotic land who is nothing to be trifled with, he knows that she is not going to let 90 bits be the cause of her attacking and beating the crap out of an old friend. So he tells her to then turn around and get back to her shoveling so that she can settle up her debt. He then asks her exactly why it is she's so penniless in the first place. She then goes on to explain that she took a job as a guard for a merchant caravan that ended up getting lost and winding up all the way in Sweden. And upon doing this, they were unable to sell their wares as they were in the complete wrong place for said wares, and wound up making absolutely no money, which meant she didn't get paid. As Katarina once again angrily drives her shovel back down into the manure, she is surprised when it impacts something metallic. She reaches down into the manure and somehow pulls out a Witchblade gauntlet. Now, I say a Witchblade gauntlet because I am not certain if this is the exact same gauntlet that Sarah Pazzini wears in the 90s. It might be a completely different gauntlet. We don't know. It's not explained at this point. She is not certain what this is, but for some reason decides to immediately put it on. This, of course, is despite the fact that Stalker has already told her that this pile of manure has been here for years, which would lead us to believe that this gauntlet should have been packed full of feces. But, again, Katarina just decided, hey, I'll just put this literal crap-covered piece of armor on my arm. The two of them are not certain what it is, as they try to decipher exactly why this was here. At this point, Stalker says it must be worth something, and the two begin to argue over who exactly owns it. Katarina saying that she's the one who found it, but Stalker telling her that it was in his manure pile. However, at this point, the two are interrupted when they both turn and are shocked to see a portal open up out of nowhere, and Medieval Spawn, along with a load of orcs, pour through the portal in the middle of a heated battle. Medieval Spawn looks over and notices Katarina and screams out her name, implying that they've met before. Katarina is shocked by this as she does not recognize Medieval Spawn at all, and is also distracted from the fact that the Witchblade Gauntlet is now starting to interact with her. Ever the coward, Stalker begins to retreat and yells at Katarina that she should be doing the same. Katarina is then shocked when she suddenly realizes that the gauntlet is transforming before her very eyes. It then immediately manifests a polearm into her hand, which she uses to cleave two orcs in half. She then looks at the polearm, seemingly shocked at how powerful and effective it is. However, she doesn't have time to dawdle, as she is then attacked by several more orcs, who she easily dispatches. However, it's at this point that Medieval Spawn notices a second portal open up and more orcs pour through it. He yells to Katarina that there are more coming as she continues to fight her way towards Medieval Spawn. She then tells Medieval Spawn that she doesn't know who he is or what this is about, but it seems as though the two of them are allies for the moment as they stand back to back prepared for battle. I do find it interesting that the Witchblade Gauntlet fully dissipated all of Katarina's clothing that she had on to replace it with somehow even less clothing and armor in the loosest sense of the word, as the armor is literally just her right arm where the gauntlet is and a metal bikini top. Now, obviously, this is very much in line with what we see in the 90s Witchblade series and the way that Sarah Pazzini's armor works, quote-unquote armor, more like a metal bikini type of thing. But it seems like Katarina here has even less on, as we see that her bottom is just cloth and she seems to be wearing some sort of Gambison-esque leggings along with a cloak, leaving her somewhat more exposed to take physical damage, one would guess. I mean, maybe not. She wasn't wearing that much clothing to begin with, but she was wearing a full set of pants versus having her entire ass exposed the way that she does in this getup. I get it. You know, the whole idea is that you're trying to sell the sexuality of this character along with the way that they do it in the normal Witchblade series. But it just seems to me like maybe they should have tried for something a little bit more medieval, especially given the fact that Medieval Spawn is literally encased in armor head to toe. You would have thought they would have tried to give Katarina something at least slightly more protective than this. The orcs then very foolishly try to bum rush the pair. However, it becomes quite apparent very quickly that they are no match for the combined might of Witchblade and Medieval Spawn, who easily hack their way through this assault, sending body parts of orcs flying through the air, which is pretty funny. At this point, the orcs realize they're outclassed and try to retreat. Katarina yells to Medieval Spawn that they're getting away. However, Medieval Spawn says no they're not, as he aims his sword at the retreating orcs and unleashes a powerful blast of necro energy that incinerates the orcs and blows up Stalker's Inn. Katarina is understandably shocked at this display of power as she stands looking at the smoldering inn, scarcely able to believe her eyes. And this is a time in which I want to try and point out that I think this is happening before Medieval Spawn's battle with the Violator. I say this because during his fight with the Violator, Medieval Spawn seemed to actually care about conserving his energy, whereas at this point, it doesn't seem like he's got any concern about that at all. He is just using his powers with reckless abandon and quickly draining them from his body. And this would also explain why when we saw him killed by Angela, his power level was pretty well below 6,000 at that point, which would imply that he was burning through it fast. And maybe this is one of the reasons his power level was so low, because of the events of this miniseries and his adventure with Witchblade. It's not exactly spelled out as far as I can remember, but theoretically, it seems like the most logical reason as to why that would be. With the battle seemingly over, Katarina looks over to Medieval Spawn and asks him if he's some kind of a sorcerer or something. Medieval Spawn responds by telling her yes, or something. She then asks how exactly he knew her name and if they had met before. Medieval Spawn tries to cover his tracks by telling her that they have never met and that he must have been mistaken. Katarina doesn't necessarily believe his answer, but decides to go with a different line of questioning as she asks him how on earth he and all these monsters just appeared out of nowhere and who he is exactly anyway. However, during this conversation, the two of them failed to notice that one of the orcs that they thought they had killed was actually just playing possum and has been sneaking up behind them for another attack. However, before this orc can execute said attack, he is struck through the back of the head with a crossbow bolt fired by Stalker. Katarina is shocked that Stalker is still alive, but Stalker tells her to save it as he wants to know why this maniac just leveled his inn. Medieval Spawn tells him that it was unavoidable as Katarina tries to reason with Stalker, saying, "Hey, you wanted the inn gone anyway." Stalker replies by saying, "No, I wanted to sell it for a profit, and what the heck is that thing in your hand?" Katarina then raises up the Witchblade gauntlet as the pole arm then magically absorbs back into it. She states that she doesn't know exactly what this thing is, and that when the fighting broke out, it just kind of took over. And despite the fact that she really doesn't understand any of it, she does tell Stalker that the one thing she does know is that she likes it. Stalker is seemingly unimpressed as he's still angry about his inn being destroyed, but at this point, they are interrupted by Medieval Spawn, who tells them that he is going to go back through the portal before it closes so that he can rejoin the battle in Faerie. Katarina then becomes distraught as she tells Medieval Spawn, "You can't leave, I have too many questions." However, Medieval Spawn responds telling her that the land of Faerie is under assault by the forces of darkness under the command of Lord Cardinal, and that if he doesn't return, they'll be overrun by his army. He then tells her that these portals are opening up, connecting their two worlds, which is how he got involved in the battle to begin with. And though he has already slain 10 scores of the Darkness's army, still his forces continue to come, and he has to return to Faerie at once, lest their land fall to the armies of darkness. He then steps back through the portal and disappears. This makes Katarina very unhappy as she doesn't know what the next move should be. However, at this point, Stalker chimes in. He tells her that the legends of Faerie state that their treasures are vast and mountainous, and that there's gold and diamonds everywhere, and that if the two of them follow Medieval Spawn through this portal, they could become rich beyond their wildest dreams. He does then try to desperately convince Katarina to go with him through the portal, and though she's hesitant at first, she is suddenly surprised when the Witchblade gauntlet raises itself above her head and begins to glow with a bright light. She then looks at the gauntlet and states that someone else or something else agrees with Stalker, so she decides to go along with his plan as she puts the hood over her head and the two of them follow Medieval Spawn through the portal. Meanwhile, back at the Citadel of Lord Cardinal, he's been observing this entire event unfold and is none too happy that a second warrior is now joining the fight to stand against him. He then asks Matthew what exactly that thing on her arm is. Matthew, in a very stunned look, tells Lord Cardinal that it's a witchblade as he can scarcely believe what he's saying. He then states that he had heard that these weapons existed, but he was never certain if the legends were true. At this point, however, he's interrupted by Lady Eleanor, who asks Matthew if this witchblade poses any threat to their plan. And Matthew doesn't respond. He just stares wide-eyed through the looking apparatus, mirror, whatever the heck this thing is supposed to be, and tries to figure out what he's seeing as Eleanor calls his name again, and we reach the end of the story. We then get to 2 pages which are advertising what in my opinion was a really cool contest. The contest in question was for readers to submit artwork depicting their favorite Top Cow character as a medieval Top Cow character. And I think this is a super great idea. The grand prize of this contest was to have your artwork printed in issue number 3 of this miniseries. So Hopefully that all worked out, and we're going to see it when we get to issue number 3 of this miniseries. And also, you would get a variant of issue number 1, which, if you're wondering, the variant issue of this issue, as far as I can tell, is exactly the same, except on the cover, the Medieval Spawn Witchblade logo is in gold foil. And it's fully autographed by everyone involved in making the book, which honestly is super cool. But generally speaking, I just find this to be a really great contest altogether. I mean, obviously, you know, these characters aren't going to probably get used long term or anything like that. But to come up with a complete, like, Middle Ages medieval version of characters like Stryker or, you know, like Killraiser or something like that would be super cool, and I hope that it looks really good when we get to it in issue number 3, fingers crossed. We then get an advertisement on the final page of the book for Medieval Spawn Witchblade issue number 2, which, if you stay tuned, I will be making an episode about next month. And on the reverse inside cover, we get Top Cow news for April of 1996, talking about upcoming issues such as Cyberforce 21, Weapon Zero number 3, Witchblade 5, Medieval Spawn Witchblade number 1, and Ballistic Special Action. I have some of these issues, but I definitely don't have any single issues of Ballistic. I'll have to try and find those. And I don't have any issues of Witchblade whatsoever, which I'm desperately trying to look for, but I'll find them eventually. But stay tuned, because eventually I am going to get to these later issues of Cyberforce, and will, at one point or another, begin looking at my issues of Weapon Zero. So just, you know, hold tight. On the horizon, these things will happen at one point or another. And that was Medieval Spawn Witchblade number 1, and it should come as no surprise that I really like this book, as I've stated many times on the channel that this is one of my favorite Spawn miniseries. And despite the fact that I don't have a lot of familiarity with the characters of Witchblade or the Darkness, I still find this miniseries to be very interesting, because it shows us that the characters of Witchblade and Darkness seemingly are intertwined throughout all of history, and that their stories and lore span back seemingly just as far as that of the Hellspawns, which I think adds a lot to their modern day versions. Now, obviously, this miniseries doesn't necessarily directly tie into the ongoing Spawn or Witchblade or Darkness, and I'm not certain if Darkness at this point had spun off into his own solo series, but still, it's a fantastic read. Every part of this book is just fun start to finish. It's entertaining, it's energetic, it's action-packed, and I honestly believe that the team that produced this book just did a bang-up job. They really knocked it out of the park. But then again, this is just my opinion. Your opinion may be completely different. You might have thought that this book wasn't entertaining and that you don't care about any of the medieval versions of these characters and believe that the artwork wasn't great or that the writing was bad. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.